Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Today we are joined by Neil Morissetti from University College London and Chatham House. Neil leads efforts to develop societies and policymakers' understanding of the security implications of a changing climate, including the impact on the key natural resources of food, water and land. His work focuses on the relationship between these emerging challenges and more traditional threats to national security. Neil has previously served as the UK Government Climate and Energy Security Envoy, the Foreign Secretary's Special Representative for Climate Change, and he is a retired Rear Admiral in the Royal Navy.
The security communities around the world, and I would include European ones, I'd include the UK as well as Americans, do recognise this as a threat. The challenge they face, I think, is a prioritisation.
The impact of climate change is not always direct.
And as you get this growing instability, you start to see climate change not being the direct cause of conflict, but compounding the risks of conflict.
The challenges are growing.
1 degree centigrade rise in overnight temperature, 10% drop in rice yields. Its work at Chatham House in the climate risk assessments has indicated that by 2050 there will be a 50% increase in demand for food, but only at the same time there'll be a 30% drop in availability.
Doing nothing is costly.
Yeah, and conflict prevention is a lot cheaper in blood and gold than conflict resolution.
Consequences rarely remain isolated.
In the Straits of Bab and Mandab at the moment, that's a pretty narrow piece of water. A lot of traffic, as we know, has to go up there. At the moment, it's not. It's going around the Cape, and as a result, Egypt is losing income from the Suez Canal, critical income for the Egyptian economy, increasing the risks of instability in Egypt. And then you get a domino effect, as we saw during the Arab Spring in North Africa.
Distant threats are complex.
I think part of the problem with climate change, of course, is that it's not impacting everybody at the same rate. And if you talked about the correlation between climate change and conflict, but it's principally in a belt that runs north and south of the equator, which is away from Europe, it's away from North America, it's away from Australia, and as a result, for many of the citizens of those countries, there is more than enough that they're having to worry about today. That longer term concern about those longer term issues, albeit that the effects of climate change are being felt in North America, they're being felt in Europe, they're being felt in Australia, but not to the point at which they are disrupting our way of life to such an extent that we can't do the things that we want to do. And until such time as that happens, I fear that we are not going to get the action that we should be taking. And that point, which it does happen, will be sufficiently far down the road that the challenges we will face to try and address it are going to be massive.
The battlefield continues to evolve.
That is the challenge that the security forces face today. On the one hand, they still need the heavy metal and the ability to fight high-intensity warfare, albeit, as we've seen in Ukraine, that high-intensity warfare is evolving in many ways with use of drones and UAVs and other things, but they still need that. At the same time, they've got to face the challenge of low intensity activity, but nonetheless stuff that can cause a risk to national interests.
Many challenges are deeply ingrained in our societies.
One thing is we've got to address what is I and many others think is a real challenge that societies face today, in that if you look at the risk to our prosperity and well-being, the issues we need to address, look at the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, these are all long-term issues. and long-term strategic long-term planning is required, and you've got to stick with it. We live, particularly in the developed world, in a short-term, immediate tactical society. We're only focused on the very near.
Are our government structures fit for purpose?
Because if you don't think the big picture and acknowledge that the models that stood as the test well in the 19th and 20th century for the way we address issues don't necessarily apply to 21st century ones. And climate change is quite a good one because it doesn't sit with one government department. It's not for defense, it's not for the Foreign Office, it's not for the Department of Energy to worry about. It's about all of government to worry about. So those wonderful silos that everything was set up in the UK, and from there many Commonwealth nations followed, of government departments where you have senior officials at the top. They're scrutinised by Parliament on a stovepipe basis. They're funded by Parliament or government on a stovepipe basis. Isn't going to work because not only are these issues cross-cutting across government, but they're cross-cutting across all of society. They need to involve industry, business, commerce in some of the solutions, but most importantly, they need to involve all of the wider society, all of us. We need to engage, and we have responsibilities that we have to acknowledge if we're going to reduce some of those risks.
We are all connected.
We need to acknowledge that actually there may be occasions when we need to be spending some of our tax income in other countries to help them address these issues, more vulnerable societies, rather than spending it on schools or hospitals or whatever in our own country, in order that those countries develop their economies, have the ability to prosper and reduce the risks of conflict and tension in the areas, because we live in a joined up world and what's happening in one country very rapidly has an impact in other countries.
We all need to open our eyes.
This sounds a bit jaundiced and cynical, but governments don't seem to want to tell the public the bad news.
The implication of ignoring the security threat of climate change is real.
So we've tended to put climate change sort of a bit of a niche issue, without perhaps understanding what the full implications of that changing climate are, because unlike many other threats or other drivers of instability that impact on countries, climate change impacts across multiple routes simultaneously, and it pushes those natural systems outside their historical ranges, and in doing so stresses the existing managerial regimes and systems. But we need to make that mainstream business. That's not to say that all the other things don't matter. Mm-hmm. But you've got to bring it all together. And I'm sorry, you want to be PM or you want to be president? Well, you've got yourself a really complex problem to look at while you're doing it.
Australia is guilty.
And also calling out when, you get a national security strategy which doesn't talk about climate change. And this is part of the discussion this morning in Australia. That has to be called out and say, you're producing a flawed strategy, and in doing so, you are risking our lives and our prosperity and well-being.
Real opportunities exist.
There is a danger, of course. You get, the bit where we're all doomed narrative. It's the end of the world is nigh, in which case people say, "Sorry, I'll go and have a party." Whereas actually, we should be saying, "Look, we face a really big challenge. It's a challenge that affects all of us, and we've got to work together, both nationally and internationally. But there's some real opportunities if we do so." That's the sort of story I think we should be telling.
Neil, thank you very much for joining me today.
Ash, I'm delighted to be here.
In 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down and the collapse of the Soviet Union happened, we all thought we were in for a long period of geopolitical stability and harmony and collaboration globally. And things haven't played out quite as we envisaged back then. Could you let us know how that journey has progressed and how that's changed things from a defense point of view?
Yeah, I think, if I recall when the wall came down, we all thought, well, that's it, job done. We can go off and do some other things now. And it's all been a lot quieter. And we can re-engage with partners around the world that we haven't worked with before. The reality, as I think we all know, is it's been very different. There's been a series of conflicts going on since 1989, 1990. Some of those have involved communities within countries, some of those involved communities between countries. But there are a number of other factors that have emerged in the nature of conflict, some of which don't even have military origins. And if we look at where we are today, we face a real challenge in the sense that there are still those traditional threats, state-on-state conflict. We're seeing one of those happening in Eastern Europe at the moment, and there's potential for similar sort of state-on-state actions in other parts of the world. We've seen the emergence of what I would call non-state actors, terrorist organizations, Boko Haram, AQ, Al-Qaeda, and others, who've played a role and a part, both in conflicts that have been happening, for example, in the Middle East, but also in Africa. And they've taken that conflict into other countries, into Europe and elsewhere. More recently, we've also seen a growth of what I would call non-traditional transboundary threats, and these are the ones where some don't necessarily have a military origin. The pandemic is a good example. The COVID pandemic is a good example of a threat to our prosperity and well-being and the economic consequences of that. Organized crime, people trafficking are other examples, but perhaps the big one, and the one that has a global impact way beyond where the physical impacts have been felt, is that of a changing climate, where we have seen, as a result of increased temperatures, increased and more intense extreme weather events, we've seen a disruption to the cycle that we've got used to. And that is now having consequences, not just in the sense that those who are directly affected, losing their land and their livelihood, but also far wider. I mean, if you look at the second order consequences of a changing climate, increased temperatures means reduced crop yields at a time when the demand for food is growing, both from population growth, but also from increased aspirations, for a better way of putting it, a more middle class aspiration in the way of food. And yet, 1 degree centigrade rise in overnight temperature, 10% drop in rice yields. Its work at Chatham House in the climate risk assessments has indicated that by 2050 there will be a 30% increase in demand for, 50% increase in demand for food, but only at the same time as there'll be a 30% drop in availability. That causes a tension. The same with water. We've always said that the great thing about water is we've never had war, and of course, I would hate to be the person trying to predict where there'd be a water war, but as a result of what is frequently water imbalance, some have got too much, some haven't got enough, then we are starting to see tensions. We're also seeing tensions where some of the non-state actors are using water as a weapon to achieve their aims. And then the trouble with all of this is that where we're seeing the greatest effects of parts of the world which have already been struggling, whether it's because the governments don't have the capacity and resilience to look after their citizens, whether it's because of being health issues, land issues, or whatever. But invariably, we can find ourselves in a position where people have got two choices. They can move from where they are because of the consequences of a changing climate, or shortages of food and water, or loss of livelihood, loss of land, perhaps because of rising sea temperatures or whatever. And if they move, well, most people don't want to move and they'll try and stay in their country. But I think, according to UNDP, it's about sort of 10, 12% of those who move outside the country. And that is manifested in a number of ways, as we've seen in the last decade in Europe, movement of populations from Africa and further afield, north and then on into Europe, and that creates a tension in Europe and allows those who wish to exploit that. The other element is you can get a trapped population. It can't go anywhere. It doesn't know what to do, but families still need to be fed. In the sense that becomes a core of people who could be recruited into those non-state actors I talked about earlier, which causes further tension. So you then start to get instability around the world. Because of that unstable world, you start to see volatility in prices of raw materials. You start to see disruption of supply chains. We are seeing that already in the Straits of Hormuz, in the Straits of Bab el Mandeb at the moment. that's a pretty narrow piece of water. A lot of traffic, as we know, has to go up there. At the moment, it's not. It's going around um, the Cape, and as a result, Egypt is losing income from the Suez Canal, critical income for the Egyptian economy, increasing the risk of instability in Egypt. And then you get a domino effect, as we saw during the Arab Spring in North Africa. The Panama Canal, because of shortage of water, has had to reduce the number of vessels that can transit the canal and the size of those vessels. That also has an impact on global trade and the income for Panama. You start to see all these links that are building up. If you've got an unstable region, then it's unlikely it's going to be a good market for exports from other countries. And as you get this growing instability, you start to see climate change not being the direct cause of conflict, but compounding the risks of conflict. Perhaps a very crude analogy is it's like pouring a bucket of petrol onto a smouldering fire. Then you've got a big fire and you've got problems. We've seen it when people have moved inside their own countries. We saw it when, as a result of a drought in Syria, the agrarian communities moved into the cities. That in itself may not have caused a problem, but the cities were already struggling, and it increased it, for a better way of putting it, historic antagonism between different communities that resulted in tension. So that is the challenge that the security forces face today. On the one hand, they still need the heavy metal and the ability to fight high intensity warfare, albeit as we've seen in Ukraine, that high intensity warfare is evolving in many ways with use of drones and UAVs and other things, but they still need that. At the same time, they've got to face the challenge of low intensity activity, but nonetheless stuff that can cause a risk to national interests. And that makes trying to sort of bring together your threat analysis or what the challenges are, building the picture difficult because you've got to merge a number of different things, which means you've got to talk to different communities. You've talked to this traditional security community, but now from climate change, you've got to talk to agrarian experts, population movement experts, and weather and climate experts. And then you've got to bring that all together and to look at that picture and say, what's it telling us? What does it mean? What are the risks posed to our societies? What have we got to do? Where are the priorities? What are the resources we've got to use? Who are we going to work with? And invariably, solutions are not military solutions anyway. They are more about trying to build capacity and resilience in countries where we're most affected. They're about helping those citizens, whether it's be through aid or development funding. And it's also reducing the cause of the problem, trying to drive down on greenhouse gas emissions through mitigation, through evolution of technology, through changing from fossil fuels to renewables and more sustainable low carbon fuels, and all the challenges that presents. Because if a country's been dependent on a fossil fuel economy and then the market drops away, what are they going to replace it with? Or you're just actually going to cause problems in those countries as well.
There's a lot there. There is very much a lot there, and it's all very, very interesting. Given what we've seen recently, and one of the things you said about water, from my experience, a lot of the underlying tribal tension in Afghanistan, which was in some ways the actual roots of a lot of the fighting, was fights between villages over water irrigation for their crops. So I think the role of water in that conflict is something that it was very pertinent and was very much part of that underlying tension. But if we look at, say, countries like Afghanistan, the conflict there, we look at what happened in Syria, which, as you said, started off with the drought and the movement of people to the cities, but then that evolved into a much more complex conflict as it became numerous proxy wars all going on at once, with the Russians being involved, NATO being involved, sectarian violence between the Sunni and the Shias, as well as the role of ISIS or the birth of ISIS and that side of things. So, and then if we look at Ukraine, that's once these things start, it's a lot easier or if you can stop them starting, it's going to be easier to do that or more beneficial to do that, because once something starts, it has a life of its own, and you can't just wind back the clock. It's another whole huge amount of effort to try and stop something once it has started. So, given that these fires are harder to put out once they've started, what do we need to think about or do in terms of, I guess, political engagement, understanding that the welfare and well-being of um, places like Africa are so intrinsically linked to the global north? What do we need to do to engage in that space to try and prevent these fires starting in the first place?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. And one thing is we've got to address what is I and many others think is a real challenge that societies face today, in that if you look at the risk to our prosperity and well-being, the issues we need to address, look at the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, these are all long-term issues and long-term strategies. Strategic long-term planning is required, and you've got to stick with it. We live, particularly in the developed world, in a short-term, immediate tactical society. We're only focused on the very near. For a better way of putting it, we're driving around on dipped headlights, and maybe we need to relearn how to drive on full beam and understand and think these things through. So that's one in the sense of process. Because if you don't think the big picture and acknowledge that the models that stood as the test well in the 19th and 20th century for the way we address issues don't necessarily apply to 21st century ones. And climate change is quite a good one, because it doesn't sit with one government department. It's not for defense, it's not for the Foreign Office, it's not for the Department of Energy to worry about. It's about all of government to worry about. So those wonderful silos that everything was set up in the UK, and from there many Commonwealth nations followed, of government departments where you have senior officials at the top. They're scrutinised by Parliament on a stovepipe basis. They're funded by Parliament or government on a stovepipe basis. Isn't going to work, because not only are these issues cross-cutting across government, but they're cross-cutting across all of society. They need to involve industry, business, commerce in some of the solutions. But most importantly, they need to involve all the wider society, all of us. We need to engage, and we have responsibilities that we have to acknowledge if we're going to reduce some of those risks. So there's that piece. And then there is the bit which is no different in the sense from a security perspective from the Cold War or before. You've got to do your analysis of what the problem is and what you've got to try and do to resolve the problem. So you've got to build that picture. And as I said before, in building that picture, you now need to be talking to a far broader audience of experts, of academia, etc. You've got to develop relationships. I mean, the Cold War, if the Baltic Fleet got a new bit of kit, or the Third Shock Army got a new commander, the chances were the relevant desk officer of the Ministry of Defence have had a phone call from someone in Oxford or Cambridge or one of the institutes like RUSI or Chatham House telling us what the implications were before we'd even thought of the question. We've got to develop those sort of relationships with experts in these new areas as well, to bring it together. And of course, if you bring in lots of information rather than a little, it's more challenging to bring that together and to fuse it. But there are tools to help us in doing that. But we need to develop the right skills and expertise to understand what that picture is telling us, what is happening, what the implications are. Do we understand what it means for our interest? Do we understand what it means for global trade? Do we understand what it means for our health or whatever? And then to be able to act on that, to reduce the risks to a level where they're manageable, to exploit the opportunities where they exist. And underpinning all of this is the other bit we've lost the knack of, is the narrative or storytelling. There has to be governments are very keen on making the cry, people must speak truth unto power. Well, actually, I think we should all expect governments to level with us on what these issues are, what the challenges are, what the implications are, what the options are. And even at times of economic, what's the term, cost of living crisis and this sort of thing, we need to acknowledge that actually there may be occasions when we need to be spending some of our tax income in other countries to help them address these issues, more vulnerable societies, rather than spending it on schools or hospitals or whatever in our own country, in order that those countries develop their economies, have the ability to prosper and reduce the risks of conflict and tension in the areas, because we live in a joined up world, and what's happening in one country very rapidly has an impact in other countries. And to explain why, so we need that narrative to explain why we need to do this, and what the benefits of doing this are. And that, I think, is key, because however much governments can try and work out what needs to be done, if they can't communicate to their citizens why the resources need to be dedicated in these areas, then they will get pushed back and back to this short-term society. Okay, fine, we'll leave it alone. Someone else can worry about the problem later on. And the reality is that in something like the impact of a changing climate, particularly the impact of that on resources, food, energy, water, and food, water, and land in particular, we know enough now to know that we should have started acting a long time ago, and we need to get on with it. It's not something you can kick the can down the road and leave it to the next government or the next generation to worry about.
Once again, lots of interesting things there. I think I was recently speaking to the International Red Cross, and they were saying that almost 60% of the countries most impacted by climate change were also impacted by armed conflict. So what you were saying about the fact that, even if there is a cost of living crisis or, economic hardship, the cost of not working with some of these countries is going to be far, far greater in the long term than the cost of doing it now, when we still have the chance to actually do something.
Yeah, and conflict prevention is a lot cheaper in blood and gold than conflict resolution.
You've mentioned the Cold War a few times. We've discussed COVID briefly and what happened there. And this is something I've pondered, and I'm not really sure what the answer is, but there's certain, with 9/11, there was a similar global, there's certain events in our history that has led the world to come together and pool resources and make hard decisions and really address big problems together. And then there's other events that have been much more difficult to get international consensus around. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on, what kind of events, what makes an event something that is easier to build that international consensus around, and what are the challenges in terms of climate change where we haven't been able to build that same level of consensus to actually do things differently.
Yeah, I wish I had the answer to this one. Yeah, absolutely. There are some instances where a strategic shock, 9/11 was a strategic shock, has an effect and brought the NATO nations together. The only time Article 5 has been declared, attack on one is attack on all. And yet I wonder today, is it the way society's evolved, we are more inward looking? We are, there was a period of globalization and everything, and now nations are looking more inward, becoming more concerned about their own interests rather than anybody else's. I mean, I kind of hope that's not the case. But there is, I think part of the problem with climate change, of course, is that it's not impacting everybody at the same rate. And if you talked about the correlation between climate change and conflict, but it's principally in a belt that runs north and south of the equator, which is away from Europe, it's away from North America, it's away from Australia. And as a result, for many of the citizens of those countries, there is more than enough that they're having to worry about today. That longer term concern about those longer term issues albeit that the effects of climate change are being felt in North America, they're being felt in Europe, they're being felt in Australia, but not to the point at which they are disrupting our way of life to such an extent that we can't do the things that we want to do. And until such time as that happens, I fear that we are not going to get the action that we should be taking. And that point, which it does happen, will be sufficiently far down the road that the challenges we will face to try and address it are going to be massive. That's a pretty cumbersome way of answering your question. But I was on a call this morning to Australia discussing a report that's just come out from their Australian security leaders group on climate change. Too hot to handle. Why is it governments aren't doing the analysis, and why aren't governments sharing the information, etc.? What do you have to do to persuade politicians to act on this? And the reality is that I think in many cases our elected representatives are at capacity, and they don't have any more capacity to look at beyond the things that are the immediate point, and will only do so when there is pressure from society to do. You don't get my vote unless you address this, and for many in developed countries, we're not at that point with respect to climate change. I mean, you could argue there's a war going on a few hundred miles away in Eastern Europe, but you wouldn't really believe it if you looked around in most of Europe, certainly most of Western Europe. If you're in the Baltic states or if you're in Poland, you would recognize it. People, are very attuned to it. But the further west you go in Europe, not really.
That's a very fascinating point, and it got me thinking, was it's the perception side of it. And if you were to walk down the streets of London 20, 30 years ago, or the streets of Sydney or New York or something like that, and walk down there today, it wouldn't be that much of a different experience. Whereas, and in the developed world, the people that are most feeling the impacts of climate change are farmers, because they're the ones who are having to adjust their management practices or deal with droughts or deal with floods or deal with different consequences of climate change. But there's a growing urban-rural divide in the developed world, and you've got only a fraction, or only 1 or 2% or 2 or 3% of people in the developing countries are farmers. So you have this, and the same thing. My parents have lived in the same house for over 40 years, and the street looks pretty much exactly the same as it did when I was a child. And so your day to day, you're not noticing those things. So I guess there's the fact that urgency isn't there, because it's something you talk about in the news, but it's not something that you see on a day to day basis.
No, I mean, the BBC have released a report today saying that sea temperatures are higher than average and have been for every day for the last 12 months. Now, what sort of impact is that going to have? Because that should be ringing alarm bells in the sense of what it means for biodiversity, what it means for fish stocks, what it means for food supplies in parts of the world. But even the analysis isn't necessarily getting into that depth. And you're actually right about farmers. I'm sitting here on a farm in Dorset where the cattle would normally be out late March. They've just gone out. We can't put any heavy machinery on the land to cut grass for silage or anything like that. We can't plant new strains, and that's a dairy farm. If you get into cereal farms and other areas, I mean, this is the first week since October it hasn't rained, I think. Most of us have got webbed feet now from wearing Wellington boots. So then you can see, then you realise that things are changing, and we've seen that over the years. But if you're, as you say, if you're in London, you can still go to the shops to buy what you want. There's no problem. Most of the time, it's there anyway. You can go and get petrol for your car or diesel for your car, and you can get on a plane or fly away on holiday and everything. So what's the issue? What's the problem? Um, and that is a challenge. It, this sounds a bit jaundiced and cynical, but governments don't seem to want to tell the public the bad news. Yeah, they want to see themselves as the good kids.
Mm.
And don't get me wrong, governments of all colours do good things. But the reality is, if you're a government in the third decade of the 21st century, you're facing some pretty challenging circumstances that are going to need some pretty intense action that's going to demand resources, it's going to demand time, and will, in some instances, result in us having to change our behaviour. But if you can put the narrative, not just what the threat is, but what the opportunities are, whether it's, for example, if we're making more use of EVs, we're burning less fossil fuel, the air quality is better, therefore our health is better, therefore there's more money for other areas that our health services can spend on. If we're generating our power ourselves, we have more energy security. We also have less volatility in prices, because obviously, if parts of the world where either we source our fossil fuels or they pass through, because the other correlation is that the world's trade routes run through that belt that we were talking about earlier on. And you get volatility of prices. That means that if you're a business, your input costs are going all over the place. So what does that mean about your competitiveness? Whereas if you're generating power through either through wind, solar, wave, or nuclear, or whatever, then you've got more stability. And ultimately, as we're talking about here, if you address those issues, you're reducing the risk to global instability, or reducing the risk of greater insecurity, and therefore, we're likely to be more prosperous as a world. Therefore, we can be a healthier world, and it's a win-win. So there is a danger, of course. You get, we're the bit where we're all doomed narrative. It's the end of the world is nigh, in which case people say, "Sod it, I'll go and have a party." Whereas actually, we should be saying, "Look, we face a really big challenge. It's a challenge that affects all of us, and we've got to work together, both nationally and internationally. But there's some real opportunities if we do so." That's the sort of story I think we should be telling.
Well, let's dig a bit more into those opportunities and where they are and where you see the greatest impact and what needs to be done, or what needs to be put together to achieve that impact.
Okay, well, let's look at energy, and the need for power. And everything needs power now, and you need secure, affordable, and sustainable sources of power if you want economic growth. We in Europe are struggling at times to achieve that. We saw what the impact of the Ukraine war was, because of the amount of fossil fuels that we were bringing in from Russia. Actually, Europe's done quite well to wean itself off quite a lot of that, but not completely. But there are other ways we could do it. There is the whole of the North African belt, the Sahel, the Maghreb, tremendous potential source of energy. Now, what we can't have is equivalent of sort of 21st century colonialism or imperialism, with just Western powers and industry just moving into the Maghreb and directing power and taking it all back to Europe. But what we could do is work with the populations in those countries, and I don't just mean the rulers, I mean the local populations as well, to develop their energy industry, whether it be through solar or wind, principally for the benefit of those nations, so that they can boost their economies and they can look after their people. But there would be surplus power that, through high voltage DC cables, can go through the Mediterranean into Africa, into Europe, and address some of Europe's issues. So in that sense, you've got a win-win. Now, it's very easy to have this conversation now. Doing this, it's much more challenging on the ground to do that. But nonetheless, that's the sort of things that we should be looking at. But again, they have to be done collectively. It's no good one party saying this is how we're going to impose a solution on you, because one size does not fit all. And the reality is that this is these global challenges invariably need local or regional solutions to address them. But those local and regional solutions can be informed by the sharing of knowledge, understanding technology, intellectual property between nations and between communities.
That's very fascinating because if you actually think back, to the Roman Empire's time, that Egypt was the provider of grain to Europe for a good probably 1,000 odd years, and at that stage, the major energy requirement of humans was food. So it's not unusual that we'd go to the other side of the Mediterranean to get our energy supplies for. It's just the fact that it looks different to what it has looked like in the past.
And you know, another potential benefit from that, although actually we need to work even harder to make sure that we can help the countries in the Sahel, is those populations who've been, or those displaced people have been moving north and then going further across the Mediterranean, risking their lives in doing so, and not necessarily getting a very warm welcome when they get there, may well not need to do that because there will be alternatives as well, in the sense of potential opportunities for work and for livelihoods.
Oh, that's very much true. And then you mentioned that something in the order of 10% of people, when things get that tough, will move. And when you think of the continent of Africa, well over 1 billion people, that's 100 million people on the move, which
and we saw in 2015 what 1 billion people, the impact it had in Europe. It may well have been one of the factors of, in fact, I'm pretty sure it is one of the factors of why we're no longer in the European community.
So this goes, I guess, in some ways back to politicians selling this message, having the right politicians in place. And as someone who works in academia and for a think tank, how the people who think about this at your level get that message across to the political to the politicians to raise it on the agenda? What needs to be done there to get that more front and center?
I mean, I think there's a piece which, continuous sort of low tension pressure of providing information, etc. There is a bit that says every now and then you've got to say, come on, wake up and smell the coffee. And these are the reasons. And, it's in your interest. Do you want to stay in power? Do you want to have the opportunity to do the other things you're doing? Because you could find yourself, as we saw with the pandemic, you can be completely disrupted. All your plans can go completely down the pan because of something like that. And I think it's about working with policy advisors as much as policy makers, so that those policy decisions are properly informed by, whether it be by science, technology, or by social sciences, and continuous engagement, and also calling out when you get a national security strategy which doesn't talk about climate change. And this is part of the discussion this morning in Australia. That has to be called out and say, you're producing a flawed strategy, and in doing so, you are risking our lives and our prosperity and well-being.
On that note, I think back in the 80s, would have been during George Bush Senior's time in office, the military, the US military or DoD, highlighted that climate change was a threat. So, it has been seen in military circles at times in the past. I've had some, I know NATO is doing some work in terms of that threat. Why do you think that, certain governments seem to be not, since it's been around and since some militaries, especially the US military, has been seen as a threat for so long, other allies are not kind of taking that as seriously as maybe they should?
I think increasingly the security communities around the world, and I would include European ones, I include the UK as well as Americans, do recognize this as a threat. The challenge they face, I think, is a prioritization in the sense that, if we'd had that peace and quiet at the end of the Cold War, we could have actually said, right, okay, we can think about this, about all the new equipment and the training, the new missions and everything we're going to find ourselves doing. But the reality is we might have had a couple of days to draw breath, and then we were back into the cycle of activity again. But I think part of it is, as well as the pressure, and the pressure not just on time, people, but also on resources, on needs, there is a limited understanding of perhaps of what you can do to address the issues. And that we're back again to this, intelligent, this body of experts you can draw upon to not only tell you what the problem is, but also what some of the solutions are. I also think that if the ministers or their equivalents in government departments aren't getting pressure from the electorate on these issues, but they are getting pressure about what's going on in other areas, and that means that the security resources could be used on other tasks, then the reality is that's what will get the priority. Virtually every country has done analysis. The UK Ministry of Defence has done a lot of work on the impact, and is looking to both adapt and ensure that it's got the right capabilities in the future, and that it is looking to drive down its emissions and potential contribution to exacerbating the situation. But the challenge is there are finite resources and there are a finite number of people, and there are other calls on their time. So we've tended to put climate change as sort of a bit of a niche issue, without perhaps understanding what the full implications of that changing climate are. Because unlike many other threats or other drivers of instability that impact on countries, climate change impacts across multiple routes simultaneously. And it pushes those natural systems outside their historical ranges, and in doing so stresses the existing managerial regimes and systems. But we need to make that mainstream business. That's not to say that all the other things don't matter, but you've got to bring it all together. And I'm sorry, you want to be PM or you want to be president? Well, you've got yourself a really complex problem to look at while you're doing it.
If it was easy, we would have solved it a long, long time ago. And someone in kindergarten or something would have solved the problem and everything like that. You mentioned earlier that strategic long-term planning is vital for this, and I couldn't agree with you more on that one. Given, depending on where you are, 3 years in Australia, 4 years here in the United States, 5 years in the UK with the electoral cycles, and the challenges of long-term planning with that, do authoritarian regimes and non-democracies, are they at somewhat of a strategic advantage because they will be more able or find it easier to have that strategic long-term planning?
Yeah, potentially. If they see these as issues that need to be addressed, clearly an authoritarian regime, it is easier for them to impose a direction of travel and an approach than it is for democracies. Interesting. I mean, in 2008, the UK passed the Climate Change Act with almost unanimous agreement, irrespective of whether you were a Conservative or a member of the Labour Party or Liberal Democrats or whatever. That held for a while, but more recently we're seeing factions growing on both sides of the political divide about, is this the right use of resources when there are other priorities? And that you just have to accept. Cross-party agreement's fantastic. You can make a lot of real progress. But I think it's back to that advice that we can give policy advisors and policymakers, irrespective of your political views, these are issues that need to be addressed, and you should broadly be in consensus. There might be a little bit variations around the edges. We need the likes of the Climate Change Committee to hold governments to account as to whether they're actually complying with the law and the subsequent law that Theresa May brought in about our commitment to net zero by 2050. And each country has its own equivalent of this, or many countries do. But our elected representatives need to be held to account on that.
Neil, thank you very much. Before we go, is there anything else that you'd like to add that we haven't yet discussed?
I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, actually.
It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
You've been listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Neil Morissetti, recorded in California in May 2024.